It's big, mean, and green. Introducing the Earthen Aggro Deck, GaffarForce. The goal of this deck is to get too big too quickly. This is the Earthen version of an aggro deck. It's an excellent answer to those fast Kathari Marcolians that keep ending your win streaks. Today, I'll review the full deck list, discuss the key cards and combos, plus walk you through the overall strategy. The key cards that you absolutely have to have in this deck are: first, Primea Conduit. This is a 1 energy, 1/1 defender, and that doesn't sound like a big deal by itself, but it's got a really interesting ability that when you play it, it spends all of your remaining energy, and it gets +1/+1 for each energy spent this way. So it's not really a 1/1 unless you only have 1 energy left to play. If you play it on, say, turn 5 with 4 energy left, then you end up with a 4/4 defender instead. Next, we have Steward of the Garden, and this is an absolute staple in every single Earthen deck. It is a 1 energy, 0/4 unit, but it has the unique ability that it generates an additional energy for you at the start of your turn. So this is absolutely the card that you want to play on turn 1, whether you're going first or second. Get that Steward of the Garden out. When you do, you end up with 3 energy on turn 2, which leads us to the next card, which is the Dauntless Axeman. Dauntless Axeman is a 3 energy, 5/5 unit, but it is quite unique in that it's the only unit in the entire game that has this ability. It comes onto the field pacified, and every other turn it activates and drops the pacify. This means that it becomes an active attacker just only on every other turn. That's why you're getting such a big unit for so cheap. However, it's a major benefit for any Gaffar deck to have the Dauntless Axeman out there, because every other turn when he pacifies, that triggers the +1/+1 buff from Gaffar. So this essentially makes him self-buffing. It's also going to buff all of your other units. And the other thing is that some of the time when you deploy Dauntless Axeman, it triggers the buff upon entry to the board. I think that might actually be a bug, but for right now, it does happen. It just doesn't happen every single time. So you're going to find sometimes you play it, it stays 5/5. Sometimes you play it and it also triggers the +1/+1. Either way, it's eventually going to trigger that, and that will give some attack power to your Steward of the Garden as well. And because it's a 5/5 or 6/6 unit, right when it comes out on turn 2, it is next to impossible for your opponent to remove it quickly. That means that at least a couple of those buffs are likely to trigger. That is going to make the rest of your board a lot more difficult to deal with. And then the other absolute Earthen staple card is Mizra Loyalist. Mizra is arguably the most broken card in the entire game. It's a 2 energy, 1/3 unit, which doesn't sound like that big a deal, but it has this bonkers Retaliate ability. Retaliate means anytime that you take damage, this gets triggered. And its ability is that it gives itself +1/+1, but it also gives +1/+1 to all of the other Mizra Loyalists in your deck, regardless of whether they're in your hand, in your bank, in your waist, or in your deck. That means that the first one you play gets buffed, and it's buffing the ones that are coming behind it. So the second one comes out even bigger. If you get all 3 of them played in a single game, then the third one is going to be gigantic because it keeps on getting bigger. And the only effective way to remove Mizra is really banish, which only Shroud can do, and the Black Market Fixer. There's a couple other exceptions, but for the most part, those are the only 2 problems that you're going to run into in terms of removing your Mizra, and that's because attacking it with smaller units is buffing it up at the same time. So you often have to sacrifice 2, 3, 4 units just to take out a single Mizra, and even worse than that, you're buffing the ones behind it as well. So it gets to be really nasty. Next, let's take a look at the key effects. There are 4 of them in this deck, and they are all earthen staples. The first is Cleanse the Earth. This is a 2 energy removal card that bounces a target unit back to the owner's hand. If you have less than 10 health, it does it to 2 units at the same time, which is extra nice. You typically want to deploy this against token-based units when you can. Remember that paragons are token-based. The reason for that is tokens are not a card, which means it does not actually go back to your hand, it just gets destroyed. So great way to counter any paragon in the game, especially Brand, who gives this deck a little bit of trouble. You can Cleanse the Earth and it just disappears. Very nice. The next one is Change of Heart. For 3 energy, you get to pacify any target unit. This is a great way to slow down your opponent, take a big unit off of the field effectively, and when you're using it with a Gaffar deck, which we are here, that means that your entire board is also going to get +1/+1 every time it plays. For just 3 energy, that is very efficient. Next is Virulent Spores. This is a 3 energy board wipe. It does it by applying decay to all units. That means your units as well, but that's okay because our units can take it much better than our opponents. We are going to position our units better than our opponents because we know Earthen and we know that the decay is coming, and that becomes a really, really great way to remove all of the units that fast decks are deploying against you. Kathari and Marcolians hate when they see this card come out because it pretty much wipes their entire board in one turn. Even better than that, our Mizra actually wants decay because Mizra retaliates every time it takes damage. That means that decay won't kill it, so it only gets bigger and bigger, plus the Mizras behind it get bigger as well. Finally, we have Formidable Presence. This is a 4 energy effect that is really powerful. It allows you to take up to 3 cards out of your bank temporarily, and they become Bulwark Seeds. Bulwark Seeds are 2/2 defenders, they're battle ready, and they are indestructible. That's right. So you can take up to 3 of them out, deal up to 6 damage directly to any unit or the opponent's face, and do some heavy damage, but then also set up a wall that they cannot get past on the next turn because they are indestructible and they are defenders. They're going to block every attack that comes at them. Let's quickly talk about the Mizra combos that we have available in this deck. Mizra is nasty all by himself, but we've got several cards in here that make him even harder to deal with. 2 of them are upgrades, and the other is a complementary unit. The Cape of Char Mahal is an upgrade that allows you to fully heal your Mizra once it gets destroyed. Remember, your Mizra is going to be growing as it takes damage, and fully healed means all the way back to the maximum, not the original health of 3. So if your Mizra gets up to, say, 5/6, and then your opponent takes it down with, say, a Lancer tank, then it's going to destroy the Cape instead and fully heal back to 6. Wicked, wicked, wicked. Even nastier than that, the Malachite Shield is another 3 energy upgrade, and this gives +1/+4 and Defender. Now that +4 to the Mizra's health is nasty all by itself because now it has 7 health, plus it grows on Retaliate, which makes it even harder to remove. But the Defender part is really key here because that means that any small unit can't attack at all. If they only have 1 attack damage, then they are making no progress at all in terms of damaging the Mizra, and it's even worse, it's going to increase Mizra's attack power when it does so. So this means that only big units can really attack your Mizra. It's still going to get a buff to counteract that, and your opponents, unless they are Marcolians with lots of face damage, they really have no way to hurt you once that happens. Finally, we have the Arrisah Skyscout. This is a 4 energy, 4/5 defender, which is fantastic all by itself. The reason why it's so cheap, though, is because it hits the board with decay automatically. But that's okay. We want decay on our board. You need to be careful with your positioning here, but what you want to do is play a Mizra on the outside, then play a Skyscout outside of that. That means that the only adjacent unit to the Skyscout is Mizra, which only gets buffed up when it takes that damage. That damage is just 1 point, so it's a free buff every single turn while your Skyscout slowly disappears. Ideally, get a second Mizra on the other side of the Skyscout as soon as you can so that it also gets buffed up. And now both Mizras are getting free buffs at the start of every one of your turns. Nasty. The general strategy for this deck is really, really simple. Get really big, really fast, and that by itself will be too much for your opponents to deal with. However, there is absolutely an ideal start here, and when you draw the right cards, there's very little your opponent can do to slow this down. Turn 1, you're playing Steward of the Garden. Be very aggressive with mulliganing your cards if you do not get a Steward of the Garden on your initial hand, because playing that turn 1 makes a big difference. In fact, I played against a similar version of this deck last night against a good player in Platinum twice in a row. Both times I got to go first. Both times he was unable to get a Steward of the Garden on turn 1, and both times I was way too fast for him, even though I was playing a Marcolian deck that is a bad matchup against that deck. The reason why you want Steward of the Garden on turn 1 is because on turn 2, if you also have a Dauntless Axeman, you can play that on turn 2. That is a 3 energy card, but with the Steward of the Garden on turn 1, you're going to have 3 energy on turn 2, which means you can play Dauntless Axeman. He gets a buff when he comes in, so 6/6 unit on turn 2 is wicked. He will be pacified from the start. That's where the buff comes from, and that's going to make your Steward of the Garden a 1/5 unit if it didn't take any damage on turn 1, which is great because it's only turn 2, and that means that Steward of the Garden is going to be really effective at removing the small units your opponent is playing without actually losing it. And to be frank, once we get to turn 4, 5, 6, we don't really care as much if we still have our Steward of the Garden on the board. It's nice to have that extra energy as long as possible, but you really want it in the early rounds so that you can go too fast for your opponents to keep up with. If you did not have a turn 2 Dauntless Axeman, Mizra is almost as strong here. It's not using all 3 energy, so you might be able to play one other card as well, but it's a really, really nice thing to get a Mizra out on turn 2, because at 1/3 it is also going to be in good position to remove early units, which means that it will also get buffed up instead of being sacrificed, which is a strong start as well. If you do not have the Steward of the Garden, then turn 2, your ideal, of course, is going to be the Mizra. Then on turn 3, you can play another Axeman or your first Axeman if you had a slow start. If you started with the ideal of Steward of the Garden, then Dauntless Axeman, on turn 3, you will have 4 energy, and you will have the option of playing Gaffar. That is playing your Paragon very, very early, but remember, Gaffar is a 0/8 defender, and that is really going to stuff up your opponent, especially against a fast deck. I really like this play against Kathari and Marcolian. Against other decks, you might want to wait a little bit longer. Against Shroud, you definitely want to wait longer because they're absolutely going to have an erasure ready for that Paragon, if not a flat circle, and so you're going to lose your Gaffar very easily. But against the fast decks, they really have no answer to that, and that puts you in wonderful position to control the entire game. When you get a fast start, your units are going to be bigger than your opponents, and they're going to be self-buffing. That means they're going to last a really long time and do a lot of damage. You're simply stalling at that point for the rest of the game. You do that by continuing to maintain board advantage by playing the big units as you get them. You continue to make your units bigger with upgrades and other buffs as you're able to trigger them, and you deploy Virulent Spores plus Formidable Presence and some Cleanse the Earths to stall and slow down your opponents while you continue to hammer away with your big green units. When you draw poorly, you're going to play whatever you got to maintain board presence, and then shift to using Virulent Spores and Formidable Presence to help catch up a little bit. Over time, you are going to draw your big units. There are plenty of them in the deck, and then you can start deploying your strategy. It's a bit harder when you get the slow start, and your games are going to last a little bit longer, which means your opponents are going to have more options to potentially come back or maintain control. Okay, let's talk about the 3 legendaries inside of this deck. The first one is Rangsei Master Imposter, and Rangsei's in here because she essentially serves as a 4th copy of both Mizra and Dauntless Axeman, but even better. She's going to cost 4 energy to deploy, so typically you're going to want to copy a higher energy unit than a Mizra or a Dauntless Axeman, but in this case it is strategic. The Mizra and Dauntless Axeman in this deck are both self-buffing units, so they last a really, really long time. The Mizras buff each other, so more Mizras is always a benefit, and the more Dauntless Axeman you have on the field, the better as well, because each one of those triggers Gaffar's +1/+1 every other turn. If you stagger their pacifies, then you'll get 1 on every single turn. Otherwise you get +2/+2 on one turn and nothing on the next. Either way, it's really, really strong. And even better than that, when she gets played, she's going to copy all of the buffs that they have already received. So if your Dauntless Axeman is at, say, 8/8, when you copy it, you're going to get another 8/8 Dauntless Axeman. Even better than that, when you do manage to destroy a Rangsei copy of something, it goes back to Rangsei and you have to kill it one more time before it gets removed from the board. Otherwise, it will recopy at the end of your turn, and your opponent will certainly be crying if that happens. Then we have Gaia's Call. Gaia's Call is a powerful finishing move and really makes the late game for this deck a lot more dynamic. For 5 energy, you can play this relic, and at the start of each of your turns, it gains a counter. When it gets to 3 counters, it gets destroyed and plays all of the units in your bank on the field. They ignore Pacifist and they are battle ready. So this is a massive wave of attacks that come right at your opponent's face and typically will end the game. Important to note, if you're playing Gaia's Call, you want to put a Primea Conduit in the bank every single game. This is because Gaia's Call is not going to trigger until late in the game. You're going to have 8 or 9 energy, and the Primea Conduit can spend all of that energy to buff itself up, and it means that you will also get a 8/8/9/9 defender as part of that attack. Finally, Gaffar's Peace Pipe is a powerful relic in this deck as well. It is a serious stall card because it is going to dish out 6 pacifies over 3 turns. At the start of each of your turns and your opponent's turn, the controlling player will randomly pacify one of their units. This is going to trigger the buff, but it's also going to take out a lot of the units from being able to participate. This benefits us, even though it's going to target some of our units as well, because often our units are going to have Defender. That means they can still block attacks, and we're also going to have more big units to play, so we're not too concerned. But also, we're not going to play this card unless we're a little bit behind and we need some time to catch up. I hope you found this video fun and educational, and if you did, consider giving us a subscribe by clicking the button below. It only takes a second to support the channel, and you're not going to want to miss any of the excellent parallel content coming from the Freeroll in the future.